This introduced quite a lot of concerning new measures that would definitely restricted the right to protest and built upon Section 12 and 14 under the serious disruption element of the Public Order Act 1986. So new definition of serious disruption included limits to travel, limits to noise in terms of what you can do at protest. So it very much defined that serious disruption even more, and the bar or the threshold for what restrictions police can impose to even lower standards in terms of being able to impose on noise and travel, like I mentioned. There was also a ministerial amendment introduced which allowed extra protest powers to be added late in the bill without any consideration of scrutiny as well, which was concerning. Any conditions imposed on assemblies meant that police could now impose full restrictions on static protests, not just marches as well, which wasn't the case before this act. One-person protests as well was also introduced as something that could be added to in terms of restrictions, which is concerning. Knowledge of conditions as well is that ought to have known point I mentioned as well, which is quite a difficult one when, someone can't maybe anticipate the type of impact or disruption that a protest might have, and is quite a subjective test as well, so very concerning in that regard. And then there was also elements of criminal damage to memorials that was introduced after a few incidents that happened around that time as well, which is concerning in terms of them being just quite wide-reaching and a bit not necessary and proportionate in terms of the restrictions. And then protest near Parliament's Square were also expanded in terms of restrictions, and that allowed or meant that people weren't able to really protest as readily outside Parliament as they were before this act was introduced. So the Public Order Act was another piece of legislation introduced the following year that built on even more in terms of restrictions, in terms of the legislation that we've seen come in recently, and the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act. So new offences, including restrictions to locking on, which is quite a calling tactic in terms of just linking arms or even just holding on to something is quite a broad thing. So massive restrictions on what that meant in terms of what police could do if someone was locking on, so to speak. There was also obstruction to transport or infrastructure restrictions introduced, and tunneling, and then also a more than minor disruption test to the Public Order 1986 Act, which was the serious disruption condition that I mentioned at the very start of this presentation that I'll talk a little bit more in a second. So yeah, those were all very concerning measures, and there was also suspicionless stop and search powers introduced as well, which meant that police didn't have to have due probable cause to stop and search someone, that power could just be applied, and police could stop and search anyone at protests just on the basis of this suspicionless stop and search. And we also introduced an offence for trying to obstruct that stop and search from happening as well, which was deeply concerning. It's deeply concerning. There was also the serious disruption prevention orders called protests like ASBOs. ASBO is the antisocial behaviour orders that were introduced by the Blair government in the late 90s. And these were very much individually based and not a criminal charge, but were civil, but resulted in some criminal liability if breached, which was also concerning. That is also concerning. So on the more than minor point that I mentioned, Liberty's challenge came around on the basis of this more than minor definition to serious disruption. So under regulation added to the Public Order Act, the government used secondary legislation to redefine serious disruption after Parliament had already rejected the proposal of a more than minor test for serious disruption. Leary brought a judicial review case that this was unlawful and undermined parliamentary sovereignty, since government at that time went ahead and introduced it anyway, even though Parliament struck it down. So we actually won the case back in May to say that the process of introducing those regulations that included the more than minor tests for serious disruption was unlawful. It wasn't on the actual basis that the test itself was unlawful in terms of more than minor, unfortunately, although that was a concern for us. It was on the process of introducing those regulations when they didn't have the power to introduce them. And Parliament had struck them down, and it was unlawful for the government at the time to introduce it. So it was very affirming in terms of, like, yeah, the fact that those powers were stricken down, but still concerning that we have the legality of that more minor test wasn't the thing that was most focused on during that case. So we now have another bill. They kind of seem relentless and almost yearly at this point, but we now have the crime and policing bill, which is actually due to have its second reading in the House of Lords tomorrow, actually. But again, includes more measures that aim to restrict protests and in quite concerning ways. Some of the things that we're focused on at Liberty here is the face coverings restrictions that are included under the bill. This would include a preemptive ban across protest areas on face coverings, meaning that if someone had a health condition, wore a face covering for religious reasons, or maybe wore a face covering because they were speaking out politically and feared reprisals from doing so, wouldn't be able to provide an exemption for wearing a face covering until they were in court under these restrictions. So it'd be a blanket ban on just masks or concealing identity within protests generally, which is very concerning. The fact that, the exemptions wouldn't be allowed to be considered by the police until, after arrest is deeply concerning for us, and something we're working on currently. Another measure in the bill is also restrictions on protests near places of worship. This is quite concerning as well, just because of the language that's used currently in the drafting of the legislation, which is a vague vicinity test around places of worship. So if a protest is within the vicinity of a place of worship and may intimidate a person of reasonable firmness, I think is the test for that. So that's very concerning in terms of just being quite wide and difficult to manage. And yeah, not a test that we can really use likely. I think in Parliament Square there's several places of worship, so in terms of things being in close proximity and not actually working in practice, I think is very concerning in that regards, in terms of not actually protecting the right to religious freedom or worship, and also restricting the right to protest. So it's not doing a good job of either, realistically. And then also there's just the fact that the police already have powers to deal with face coverings as well. Police already have powers to ask people to remove items concealing identity, and already have powers to deal with intimidation and harassment as well. So we're very much wondering why these powers are introduced when police already have powers to deal with the issues that these new powers need to address. So cumulative disruption announcement. This is the most recent thing that we've seen from the government just a couple of weeks ago, actually. This was part of the regulations that were quashed in our case that we won. Again, not under the legality of the measure, but under the process. But regardless, we're still very concerned with this new announcement. The announcement of cumulative disruption is off the back of the potential that protests are creating an environment of intimidation and fear, and several protests in the same area are kind of having a cumulative impact. But what is very concerning is just the fact that the previous regulations laid out that it might not even have to come from one person or one organizer for it to count as a cumulative disruption, but could come from any different number of organizers or groups setting up a protest that would then translate into a cumulative effect of disruption, which is very concerning because, yeah, protests happen all the time, and I think it's very unrealistic to say that there's a cumulative effect from different protests happening just in the same area. So we're very concerned about that measure. And the police, again, already have powers to deal with such instances of a cumulative effect under the Section 12 and 14 of the Public Order Act 1986 regulations or legislation. In, I think, 2023, the the Met Police dealt with several disruptions and that created a cumulative effect just with the existing powers that they already have under sections 12 and 14. So it's clear that the police already have the powers to deal with these matters, and this new announcement, we're not quite sure how it'll look, but it's very concerning just because it's quite vague and ill-defined in terms of what it would actually look like for police enforcing it and also for protesters enacting their right. So where are we now? We're quite a difficult place in terms of the fact that protest has become way more narrow in terms of scope and is restrictive in terms of going out and actually exercising your right to protest. The right to protest hasn't disappeared, but it's clearly increasingly under threat from these new legislation introduced throughout the last few years. Currently at Liberty, we're working with other organizations that are even in this webinar and further afield, and also parliamentarians to try and restore that balance between ensuring that the right to protest is protected and also that any concerns around, public order or safety is also protected at the same time as well. I think it's just important to strike that balance, and that's the conversations that we've been having particularly with parliamentarians and officials at the minute as well. Is just trying to have a conversation around that balancing of rights. So I think that's everything. But thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And it's so important to understand what the laws are, but also the ways in which the law changes have eroded our right to protest. And one of the impacts of that erosion has been a change in the way policing has happened at protests. And we're going to hear from Paul now from XR, who can talk a little bit about the experiences of, managing the relationship between protest and the police and the changing ways in which protest is being policed. There's a lot of P's in that sentence. I got there in the end.
Yeah, hi everybody. I would like, just before I deal with how policing has changed, I just want to mention the driving forces of the police, what's really influencing the police when they choose how to respond to a protest. And of course there is political pressure. There shouldn't be. They've got lovely principles like policing by consent, without fear or favor, protecting human rights, which is actually in their oath. It's one of the first things they say in their oath. But it's really money, resources, and professional reputation. And you'll find the professional reputation, as in, are they really controlling the streets? Are they up to the job? That takes absolute priority when there is a state visit, when there's any royal function, or if we're having a week of rebellion and they want to know what's going on. So they want to arrest a few people, download their phones and try and get some intelligence as to what's going to occur in the following week. So when these three things happen, legality and their observation of law seems to be forgotten a little bit. And the coronation was a perfect example of that, I think. Absolutely outrageous. However, when we're looking at how policing has changed since that the legislation that you've just been explained to you, I would say for me the thing that doesn't really get focused on a lot is the way that highway obstruction, the prison sentence for highway obstruction was extended from 3 months to 51 weeks, and which had no real effect on, it didn't really deter anyone from sitting in the road, because nobody was getting prison sentences for that anyway then. They were getting conditional discharges. However, that allowed the police to do directed surveillance. Once you get over 6 months for an offence, it allows them to put a camera on an address. It allows them to follow you around. It allows them to enter groups, do intrusive research. So that, coupled with public nuisance becoming an indictable offence, that allowed the police to get Section 8 pace warrants, which is to look for evidence of an offence. So they can go to a magistrate with their surveillance information and believing that you're an organiser of a peaceful protest to save life, and get a warrant to kick your door in, arrest you, and search your place for your devices, which they take away and then download. So that was a massive change for me, because suddenly they couldn't do it before. Suddenly they could go on the front foot. They could start doing stuff which is really intimidation. And what does it do? It reduces the cost to them, because if it puts people off protest, it reduces the bill to policing. Obviously, the police choose how they're going to police something, and that's down to political pressure. They could do it on the cheap and step back and allow the protest and just do a bit of traffic management, or they could try and be oppressive, which is what we've been seeing, in line with what the government is telling them. So in line with that, we also had disruptive arrests. So this kind of, they've known about this for a long time. With Notting Hill Carnival, it's been a tactic for 20 years, I think, that you do drug search warrants the day, a few days before Notting Hill Carnival, and you focus on the violent subjects that you know might be causing trouble at Notting Hill Carnival. You arrest them for drugs, you lock them up so they're not available to go to them. But that's we're talking about violence, we're talking about murders. That's that has a different level of validity, I would say. In this, so they're trying to use the same thing with protests. Disruptive arrests, they focused on conspiracy to cause public nuisance, which we saw even in 2019. People carrying food would be arrested because they might give that food to somebody else, which might prolong the protest, which might be a public nuisance. So there's a lot of mights in there, a lot of assumptions, but it allows them to impact your protest. And they also assume that you've spoken with someone in order to get the food. So that's the conspiracy bit, that's the planning bit. So we had a lot of challenges to the police in 2019 in Westminster. So they're carrying sandwiches, mate. Do you really want to nick them for conspiracy? That's a common law offence with no maximum. What are you doing? And a lot of the time we did get through to them, but obviously not enough. And then there's possession with intent to do something, where you've got to prove criminal intent. There's possession with intent to cause criminal damage, possession with intent now to lock on, to attach to something. So that is being misused by the police all the time. The way I was taught in the police, if you suspect somebody of an offence, you investigate it on the street. You try and get evidence of that intent on the street. That is absolutely not being done. It's being used as an excuse to take people off the street. We've had people arrested for possession of a fridge freezer, which was a greenwashing machine that they'd supervised 12, 16 times. Other actions. It was a funny bit of theatre, and it made a noise. It had a whirly thing, but they thought that it might be used to squirt liquid onto a building, and it wasn't. And they knew it wasn't. So a fridge freezer, smoke cartridges. They've been used many, many times. They use the Explosives Act. It's not an explosive. They haven't been prosecuted in court. They just use it to arrest people. Water sprays with water in, stickers, because they might cause criminal damage, stick of chalk, criminal damage, cable tie, attaching yourself, a piece of string to attach yourself, because that would take a long time to cut for the police to get through. Luggage straps, that was famously the Republic, who at the coronation, who basically got interned so that there was no possibility of embarrassment to the police if they had done their protest, which they liaised for 3 months before. I mean, that was outrageous, and hopefully they win their case in court. A pink lectern and several pink empty wheelbarrows have also been seized and people arrested. So because of that, we kind of, as an experiment, we tried to go the other way, and we organised the big one a couple of years ago. And this was 6 months of liaison with the police, with the Met, to get 100,000 people in Parliament Square on the same weekend as the London Marathon. Right-wing press were ridiculous. They accused us we're going to block the London Marathon. We worked with the London Marathon. They were very supportive. And it was a success. We did loads of outreach. It was a success. We got 100,000 people there. The police did facilitate it. They had a duty to do so, but it was a lot of work with somebody who's in this call today. And at the end of it, there's a think tank called Policy Exchange. I want to introduce Policy Exchange now because they did a report, and it was written by Dave Spencer, who I knew in the police, and he retired or left as a chief inspector, and he went to work with Policy Exchange. He wrote a report that said disruptive protests must be stopped because there was a disabled person at the big one who couldn't get across the road. We had 1,000 stewards who were there to help with accessibility. That wasn't mentioned, but they're basically against any dissent whatsoever. And so we went for the perfect, I would say, the perfect protest in that, although nobody's heard of it, so it wasn't very good really. But the big one had 100,000 people on the streets and didn't get one arrest, didn't get one complaint from the public, because we did so much outreach before. We spoke to all the residents, spoke to all the shops. So no complaints, but Policy Exchange thought they would publish a paper on it and say that it was bad and it should be condemned and not allowed. And that brings me to the next Policy Exchange report, which came out on the 9th of September last year, which basically it was called Might is Right. And it highlighted the fact that police have a very low bar, evidential bar, to find reasonable grounds to arrest somebody. Reasonable grounds. So, and they should use that. They should use that as much as they possibly can. Forget about prosecuting in court. Forget about evidence to charge. But if you can arrest somebody, you get them off the street. This was condoned by Matt Twist, who's a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, on social media directly afterwards, saying it was an excellent report. It's going to be positively considered. And it's basically saying that well, it's a win-win for them because they arrest people, so they stop people protesting. It impacts directly your protest. They get your tech to download. They get your biometric data, as in your face, your fingerprints, your DNA. They deter you from doing it again because if you get held in custody for 6 to 12 hours, as on average. So from their point of view, it's a great deterrent to protest, and they get lots of intelligence and information about you. And what's wrong with it? I don't think it's legal. I think it is malfeasance because it is a strategy to interfere with your legal right to protest. And it's a strategy not designed to take a person before court, to give evidence before court, but to disrupt. And that's it. And I really hope somebody here will challenge it one day, because for me, that's when the police are doing things to mess up your protest, just to mess up your protest, and not for any criminal reason, then there's something seriously wrong with our system. Right. So I've also been asked about how we help protests with protest liaison. And so I want to quickly run through that. I don't want to overrun. We had a lot of criticism because we spoke to the police when we first started. And then we kept asking, well, has it had a negative effect or a positive effect? And we didn't get any negative effect pointed out, really. So we continued it with it. And what we do, the whole basis that we try and optimize a protest. We try safety as a priority. So if we can make it safe with good communications with the police, then it's safe for everyone. It's safe for the public, it's safe for the protesters, and even it's safe for police officers as well, because everybody knows what's happening. We ask for a no surprises approach from the police. So if they're going to enforce, they tell us what's going to happen, we can pass it on. So it reduces tension, reduces the prospect of escalation to violence, which, I must say, has worked very well. Legality, we try and make sure everybody's very informed. Consent, they understand what the risk of arrest is. Is it low? Is it high? And we try and reduce that. We try and hold the police to account. Like, for example, if they overstep the law, which happens more regularly than it should. But for example, recently we did the Make Them Pay March. In the middle of that march, there was a marching band that came through. It's called the Association. And there was a complete mess up by the police. They tried to march through the stage. They couldn't bear to go on the side. They were quite aggressive. They fly a flag which says UVF on it. UVF is a prescribed organisation. And so we've now been sending emails to the police saying, how did you arrest? You've arrested over 2,000 people for holding up a sign about Palestine action, which hasn't killed anyone. And you facilitate the protest of this marching band that is celebrating a UVF that's killed about 460 people. So how do you, and we haven't had a reply yet. So I'm going to keep sending them emails to see if we get a response. But hopefully that can be used in court in some way for some of these upcoming court cases. So really it depends what kind of action it is. We try and get the action planners to decide what they want to do with their action. And sometimes they haven't worked that out before. They just want to do a march, or they want to do this or do that. But the main thing for us is, do you want to reduce the likelihood of arrest and the safety, and increase the safety of everyone, or do you want confrontation? And I completely respect the right of some groups to not talk to the police and wait for the police to misstep, be aggressive, be confrontational, and use that in the media to drive their campaign in the media. Completely respect that, but we're not that useful when it comes to those sort of protests. We're kind of redundant. We could probably give them advice as to what the police response is likely to be, but that's about it. And it's more of a legal observer type thing. What we're much better at is for actions where they, and this is the ideal really, is where we can give the police the information they want, which is what times did it finish? Can they manage their resources? Are their officers going to go home on time? That kind of stuff. And in return for that, we know they can step back, they can reduce the police presence, which is much better for marginalised communities, for example. They don't want to be overrun by thousands of police. And they can step out the way, and the best thing is for the activists to be able to give their message in the best possible way to the target that they're focused upon, without the police being in the way. So that's really our that's when we consider it a success from our point of view as protest liaison. And of course, the other thing is just with security guards, they tend to be either aggressive or they run away, one of the two. So we usually go in just to explain when it finishes, what we're going to do, that we're non-violent, it's not criminal, and kind of keep the tension down. So which is often with lobby sit-ins and things like that, where we can just say it's not going to be disruptive to people going to work, and it's not going to be intimidating. We know it's civil trespass. We understand you have a right to move us with force if necessary, reasonable force. But if you do, we're going to film it and it'll go all over social media. So please talk to your CEO before you decide to do that. 9 times out of 10, that works. So yeah, that's us. So that's what we do as protest liaison. And the window of protest that we can possibly do is getting smaller and smaller. And the most recent thing I've seen is Gal Gadot protests. I don't know if you've seen that, but the people that were involved in disrupting the filming just with noise have been arrested for harassment. So that's quite a new thing, using harassment.
Paul, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up.
On the dog.
So,
Last line. And led by donkeys who using a projection which causes no disruption and no damage. And they've used a projection and they've been arrested for malicious comms, which has now been turned into public nuisance. So which I doubt very much is going to be charged, because there's no harm to society there, and there should be with a public nuisance. So the police are overstepping more and more, and our window is getting squeezed.
thank you so much. It's so interesting and so important to understand the changing dynamics. I'm going to hand over to Sacha Ismail now from the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, who's going to talk about the role of the labour movement in challenging these anti-protest laws.
Hi, thanks, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hope
Okay.
everyone else can.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you for having me. I'm Sacha Ismail. As explained, I'm speaking on behalf of Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. If you don't know us, USC is the UK trade union and labour movement campaign in support of Ukraine and its workers' movement. So working with organisations and activists in Ukraine and its diaspora and like-minded comrades in other countries, we organise in trade unions, in the Labour Party, the Green Party, other organisations of the left and beyond. You can find out more about our campaign, join and see how to affiliate your organisation at ukrainesolidarity.campaign.org. And we're also on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky and X. Before I get going, one last plug, but a very relevant one, I think. After work on 28th of October, USC and other Ukrainian and UK organisations will be demonstrating at Reform UK's headquarters in Millbank to say stop Farage, stop Putin, and protest against Reform's increasingly glaring connections to the Russian state. We'll be protesting to contribute to growing awareness and exposure of how Reform UK's promotion of the Kremlin's agenda is central to its war against all our rights. I'm USC's trade union officer, and I'm a labour movement and socialist activist more broadly, including in the unions Unison and FBU. And what I'm going to discuss is more about how the drive against our right to protest fits into the broader political situation we face. So what I'm going to say comes from a Ukraine solidarity perspective, so to speak, but also from a broader workers' movement one. And I will signpost my call to action now. We must agitate for the UK workers' movement to spearhead a revolt against growing state authoritarianism. I'll come back to that. But let's start with Ukraine. We support its struggle as anti-imperialists. We oppose imperial violence and aggression, and we defend people's right to self-determination. Self-determination is part of a wider question of democracy, and the fight between Ukraine and Russia is also between a society with significant democratic space, however limited and flawed, and thoroughly repressive and reactionary dictatorship. The difference was shown recently and dramatically by Ukraine's vibrant youth-led protests against the weakening of anti-corruption bodies, and then against the weakening of soldiers' rights, protests that quickly forced the Ukrainian government to change course. It's also shown by the situation for trade unions and the workers' movement. On one hand in Ukraine, where they're under huge pressure not only because of the war, but the neoliberal anti-union policies of the Zelensky government, but nonetheless they still exist and organise relatively freely. And on the other hand in Russia, and even more the Ukrainian territories it occupies, where independent workers' organisations are suppressed. Now, the differences between our situation in the UK and far more authoritarian regimes like Russia or China, Saudi Arabia or Iran, say, also important. We should not forget or downplay the greater space we have to organise, campaign and struggle in a so-called liberal democratic system. We should know that space and use it to the maximum. But part of that is recognising the very clear reality that most liberal capitalist regimes are now shifting at pace towards much greater authoritarianism. The UK is a very clear example on a whole series of levels, many of which other speakers already forcefully explained. Ukraine Solidarity campaign involves labour movement people with a broad range of views, but I don't think I'm straining my position too much to say that our situation in the UK reflects in part a right-wing Labour government trying to manage the multiple crises in capitalism and the international order in the interests of capital, at the expense of workers' interests and democratic rights. Part of it is also a combination by Starmer and co. to one of the greatest drivers of authoritarianism in the world today, the Trump regime in the United States. This weekend, huge numbers across the world will demonstrate again to say no kings, no tyrants. Sorry, huge numbers across the US, I meant to say, will demonstrate again to say no kings, no tyrants. We will send our solidarity, including by joining the protest at the US Embassy in London this Saturday. So while condemning Putin, making a rhetorical point of it, the Labour government is in a definite sense accommodating Putin-type politics in the form of Trump, Reform UK, and its own authoritarianism. We've seen a number of these factors come together in the ban on Palestine action, which my campaign has spoken out very clearly against. It seems the ban was driven by complaints from particular corporations, by the Labour government's continued cooperation with the regime of Trump and Putin's friend Netanyahu, despite the genocide in Gaza, by the increasing authoritarian instincts of the Labour leadership, by general right-wing political agitation, and also, it seems, by the intervention of Trump himself. That ban has come alongside and is very much part of a broader crackdown on Palestine activism. One Shabana Mahmoud is now escalating further, as well as on climate activism, of course. Now, as a Labour movement campaign and one focused on defending democratic freedoms against a brutal imperialist dictatorship, the Ukraine Solidarity campaign opposes all this for general principled and practical reasons, even though we ourselves are not currently being heavily impacted for obvious reasons. But we do also have self-interested reasons to oppose all this. What do I mean by that? I think it's worth explaining. Another increasingly alarming aspect of the UK situation is that all the authoritarian powers and practices the Labour government is bolstering might, in the not-distant future, fall into the hands of a far-right government under Reform UK, very possibly backed up by and encouraging fascistic movements on the streets. That's true even of measures Reform currently claims to oppose, as with digital ID. A Reform government, armed with and strengthening the panoply of anti-protest and authoritarian laws, would have horrific consequences for democracy and our ability to organise all down the line. That's even more reason to fight back hard, not only against Reform, but against Labour's authoritarian measures. But additionally to those already decisive general issues, we have grave concerns specifically as a campaign in solidarity with Ukraine. It seems very plausible that a Reform government promoting the Russian regime's agenda in the UK would not only crack down further on Palestine and climate activism, but on Ukraine solidarity activism too. For our own organisation, our fundraising, collections and solidarity delegations to Ukraine, supporting essential workers behind the lines, but also army units, would no doubt provide ample hook. Remember how, in deference to Turkey, even at the height of the Kurdish struggle against ISIS, our government took action against UK citizens and residents who joined or supported the Kurdish forces. Under a far-right government more or less supporting Russia's war against Ukraine, it could be much worse. As Reform builds on and accelerates existing anti-migrant policies, the situation of Ukrainian refugees in the UK, and yet Labour has repeatedly denied the right to permanent settlement, would also become precarious in the extreme. So I want to conclude with a promised call for our trade union and labour movement to revolt against the growing crackdown on democratic rights. George Monbiot had a very good article in The Guardian on Monday, which I'd recommend reading, pointing out that the activism, struggles and disruptive protests that led to the emergence of the modern UK Labour movement, and indeed the Labour Party itself, would be anathema to and criminalised under this Labour government. My one correction to Monbiot is that the 40-year assault he describes, which is now accelerating, did not in fact begin with the 1986 Public Order Act, but with the anti-trade union and anti-strike laws of the early 1980s, laws that we're still suffering under. The workers' movement has more interest than reason than anyone in fighting, stopping and reversing the gathering assault on our democratic rights. The very limited improvements to trade union rights contained in the much watered-down Employment Rights Bill can easily be outweighed and made much closer to meaningless if our rights to protest are stripped away. As a mass movement with people in workplaces and communities across the UK with immense potential power, the Labour movement also has more possibility than anyone to do something about this, if it uses its power to raise a genuine mass storm of protest. There are glimmers of opposition. TUC Congress last month, for instance, unanimously voted to oppose the ban on Palestine action. Many more such resolutions are needed, but resolutions by themselves will not cut it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sacha, and such an important reminder of the role of trade unions in the protest movement and in the need to defend the right to protest. Our final speaker is Peter Leary from Palestine Solidarity Campaign, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sian, for this, I think, very timely webinar, which comes on the right to protest at a moment when those rights are, as others have pointed out, once again under very serious attack, most clearly through the draconian measures contained in the Crime and Policing Bill currently in the House of Lords. So I want to use the 10 minutes I have, which is a lot shorter than you think when you start to write, to talk a little bit about our experience over the past couple of years when PSC and its coalition partners have been at the forefront of one of the, if not the largest protest movement in British history in response to Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And in the face of almost blanket opposition from the British political establishment, as well as huge swathes of the press and media, and its ongoing political, diplomatic and military support for Israel's genocide. And then I want to say something about these current attacks, what they mean for us as PSC, and why they should concern everyone who cares about fundamental freedoms and democratic rights. So over the past 2 years, attempts to silence the movement in solidarity with Palestine have reflected, on the one hand, a sort of wider attempt to suppress those speaking up for Palestinian rights, whether they're protesters in the streets or academics or even the UN or the International Criminal Court. And on the other hand, this wider climate of repression that we've been discussing, directed against all forms of protest, both under the previous Tory government and then continued under Keir Starmer's Labour government. And so, while my focus today is mainly on the big national marches, we need to think about that within a context that includes the prescription of Palestine Action, a direct action group, and the many arrests that have followed of people holding signs, the use of anti-terror laws to target musical artists, amongst others, the targeting of people in university spaces, and also the fact that while many of the forms are particular to this country, there are parallels in the rising tide of authoritarianism that's been spoken of in the USA, France, Germany, and elsewhere. So from early on in 2023, we faced attempts to demonize the marches. Suella Braverman, the then Home Secretary, famously or infamously describing us as hate marches and suggesting that simply flying the Palestinian flag could be considered a criminal offence. We had calls for the marches to be banned, for the army to be sent in. Attempts to label those protesting as treasonous, unpatriotic, un-British, a term recently revived by Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood. Much of this couched in racist and Islamophobic language, culminating in the enormous Armistice Day demonstration on the 11th of November 2023, which saw far-right pro-Israel street gangs led by the so-called Tommy Robinson trying to physically attack the march in an attempt to drive it off the streets, with many of them telling journalists that they'd been encouraged by the words of the Home Secretary. Thankfully, the sheer size of the solidarity movement, combined with the behaviour and the publicised behaviour of the far right at the cenotaph before they even got near the march, meant that attempt was, at least at that moment, defeated. In fact, it was Suella Braverman who lost her job the following Monday. But alongside that, since October 2023, the police have used the Public Order Act to impose unprecedented restrictions on the routes, times, locations of marches and other protests. Now, initially, I would argue this was primarily part of this campaign of intimidation to bolster the impression of the marches as a dangerous mob that needed to be controlled and contained, requiring the marchers to stick to the agreed route or finish at the agreed time, not through a dialogue in the way that Paul was talking about, but instead, brandishing this menacing threat of arrest if anyone steps outside of those parameters that had been imposed. But I think over time, and I think especially since Labour came into office in July 2024, we've seen a shift towards using these conditions as a means to disrupt our ability to organise marches effectively, with the police seeking to use those powers to impose on us where, when, and even whether we are able to march. As many of you will know, this too came to a head in January, the 18th of January this year, when we were banned from marching either to or from the BBC, and eventually for even leaving Whitehall, and culminating in a large number of arrests. Prominent speakers, including two MPs, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, and an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor, Stephen Kaposh, called in for police questioning, and then protest organisers charged with public order offence, all for taking part in an entirely peaceful protest. So, those cases are still ongoing, so I don't want to say too much about them, but I do want to turn, because I think it sort of relates to the context, with the time I have left, to the crime and policing bill. And I know some of this has been spoken about, but I want to talk specifically about two measures that the government has made clear are particularly aimed at our marches, although they obviously won't stop there. That's the provision to afford the police greater powers to restrict protests in what Lyle has described the vaguely defined vicinity of places of worship, and then the new announcement of the provision to allow the police to consider so-called cumulative impact of recurring demonstrations when imposing these restrictions. And I think it's important to deal with these because there's been a lot of disinformation, not least from the police. So I'm sure you'll all agree with me that sites of religious worship should be protected. And in fact, the police already have powers to restrict or even ban protests where the purpose is to intimidate. But that's not fundamentally what we are, what concerns us here. So the main pretext, the main reason, not the only one, we've also had, parking spaces and disruption to businesses and other things. But the main reason given by the police over the past year in particular for preventing us from marching along various routes in London has been the alleged potential for serious disruption, that term again, to people attending synagogues. Now, obviously this shouldn't need saying, but, contrary to the grotesque accusation that those taking part are motivated by anti-Semitism, Jewish people are integral to the Palestine marches as organisers and participants. Every single march has been attended by thousands of Jewish people, many of them marching in an organised Jewish bloc, and Jewish speakers on the platform. Of the 32 national marches since 2023, none has even passed the synagogue along its route, nor indeed any of the proposed routes either. And there's obviously never been any threat or any indication of a threat to any place of worship linked to any of the marches. So the thing about what is going on, the protest at the BBC was banned on the basis of a synagogue located several streets away. In March, we were prevented from assembling at Park Lane due to two synagogues, each situated approximately 12 minutes walk away. And if you think about the dispersal of religious sites in towns and cities across the country, if these powers are now to be extended and entrenched, it would make it very difficult to organise any protest at all. There are, as has been mentioned, several churches in or around Parliament Square. And of course, this law won't just apply to Palestine protests. A pro-choice march or a pride parade could easily be blocked on objections from religious leaders that encountering it en route to church might make them feel, or make their congregations feel, uncomfortable. Potentially even more pernicious is the new proposal to give the police powers to curtail recurring protests based on their supposed cumulative impact. Now, official statements indicate this will include the power to impose legal conditions on any protest that happens in the same place as a previous protest. Now, again, although the government is primarily currently focused on marches for Palestinian rights, all those who may wish to protest for any cause should be alarmed. For obvious reasons, effective protests often recur in the same or similar places, whether that is a seat of power, like Downing Street, or whether that's a trade union picket line outside a workplace during an ongoing dispute. In fact, when Suella Braverman introduced the exact same powers in 2023, subsequently struck down thanks to the work of Liberty, the arguments used were entirely different. Then the target was disruptive climate action. But no protest has ever brought about change through a single demonstration. The civil rights movement, the campaign for women's suffrage, and the movement against apartheid in South Africa all relied on the cumulative impact of repeated protests over many years. Had these police powers existed, consecutive marches to Whitehall or Westminster demanding votes for women, or the long-running picket of the embassy of apartheid South Africa, would have been banned. So I think it's very important that we all do what we can to oppose these attacks on our fundamental rights. But I want to just finish, if I may, Sian, very briefly on a positive note, because I think that fundamentally these attacks are an attempt to use policing and use public order legislation to impose political censorship. And I think so far, at least, with all the caveats that we've been talking about, that isn't fundamentally succeeding. Last Saturday, over 500,000 people marched through London in solidarity with Palestine. And there's the slogan on the marches that if you've been on them, many of you will be familiar with. 1, we are the people. 2, we won't be silenced. And I think we need to ensure that that remains our guiding principle going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really important to understand the impact that these laws will have. We are really at time, and I really hope we've had so many fascinating and important comments in the Q&A and questions in the Q&A. I feel that many of the questions have been answered during this discussion. You know, the issues around what kind of activities are now criminalized, whether people can march or have static protests, you know, what are the risks for that? Questions around the different ways in which far-right protests have been policed compared to Palestine solidarity marches or XR marches. You know, these have all been answered as we've gone through the conversation, so I won't go over them again. There were some really specific questions, which I thought if we could just take 5 minutes, if the panelists have a bit of time, that would be quite helpful to answer. Probably most directed to Lyle, but one of them is, what is the situation in Scotland? Does the Public Order Act changes and the PSC apply to Scottish protests as well, or is it England and Wales?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, always difficulty with the two different legal systems and navigating some of the legislation and when it applies to Scotland and when it doesn't. So for the Public Order Act, 1986, so that's the sections 12 and 14, the serious disruption restrictions that can be applied, that applies to Scotland. I think the new measures under the Criminal Policing Bill will be specific to England and Wales. In that legal system. So I think, yeah, in regards to the Public Order Act and the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act, I think that's also the same. Like, but I think it's always just worth, checking the legislation to make sure that's the case. It's difficult. As I'm Scottish myself, it's always difficult trying to navigate when the legislation applies to Scotland or not. But for the overall sweeping restrictions on serious disruption, that does apply to the Scottish legal system and Scotland.
Thank you. Sacha, I think this might be a good question for you to answer in terms of organising solidarity events. You know, have the protest laws kind of, well, also to you as well, Peter, have the protest laws impacted the way we can talk about protests or do outreach for protests? You know, are people more nervous to come to these events? Are they concerned that they're going to be arrested, or, you know, or is outreach kind of unaffected and people still want to take part?
I mean, I think in a way it is a better question for Peter to answer, because for the reasons I said, because the current stance of the UK government, at least on paper, Ukraine solidarity protests don't face the same kind of conditions and atmosphere as a lot of other protests. I very much agree with Peter that the best one of the important strands of a correct response is to encourage people to protest. Yes, absolutely safely. Yes, with regard for the situation, but to continue to exercise the right to protest as strongly as possible. I think that's absolutely key.
So yeah, Peter, I'll defer to you. Have you noticed that people are more nervous, more concerned about coming to protest, and it's affected your ability to reach out to new audiences?
I think across the board there is a chilling effect of the repressive climate, and I think that there are people in university spaces, in other contexts, who are afraid to speak out. I mean, I think that the sort of the contradiction of that, and from our point of view, is that over the past 2 years, as more and more people have become aware of seeing events unfolding in Gaza and the horror of the genocide has been being inflicted, we've had more and more people actually speaking out. So the cultural space is a good example of that. People were very afraid to, would have been very afraid to speak out, and I think we're seeing more and more people, cultural figures, and so on, speaking out. Obviously, that has some impact in terms of protests. I think particularly people who are, for various reasons, vulnerable, whether their visa status or whether they're particularly concerned. People are concerned sometimes about coming on demonstrations with children and families and so on, if they have that sort of fear of arrest. But I think also the impulse to overcome it is very strong as well. So there is that countervailing force. I know that there are people who are afraid to say the words Palestine action. So, I mean, and I think that very much is about creating that chilling effect and that climate where people are are concerned that and that if they thankfully we've seen the police in Kent have now apologized for the incident where they tried to accost a demonstrator for talking about the genocide, expressing solidarity, saying that they were now in violation of the terrorism legislation and threatening to be arrested. But that's all about creating that. It all serves to create that people think, oh, if I speak out in Palestine at all, then I'm going to be captured or swept up in this anti-terror legislation. So, as Sacha says, and I think just to reiterate, I think the people, yes, should do so in protest in a safe way, know their rights, as safe as possible way, know their rights, but people shouldn't be silenced and people should continue to speak out and to get involved in protests.
Thank you. And Paul, you mentioned surveillance during your talk, and I was wondering if you could speak to the growing use of surveillance powers by the police, including things like the threat of facial recognition, and again how that might link to the sort of stop and search powers as well.
Yeah, but facial recognition is a big thing for me because from my perspective, police officers, they get a briefing in the morning, they get told about wanted people, for violent offences, and they go out and they look for them. If facial recognition, if that can do it better than humans, and it probably can, I have no issue with that. But when they're putting cameras out that are collecting facial information of people at protests so they can see who is attending the most protests, are they organisers, are they not organisers, then that is really dangerous and it should be legislated. At the moment, we've got the police saying, but we're going to use it properly. We're going to use it with a watch list and that's all. It's not going to be used in any other way. But I know personally that when money comes into the equation, the police will definitely misuse it. There is no question about it. If it's their reputation or money, they will misuse it. So we need legislation very badly on facial recognition.
Thank you. And I know, Lyle, that's something Liberty is also very focused on.
Yeah, it's a big issue of concern for us. I think what Paul just mentioned in terms of legislation on regulation of facial recognition is so important because it's so unrestricted at the minute. We have been involved in a case that struck down facial recognition with South Wales Police a few years ago and very much campaigning on that issue still today, and is very much a concern when it comes to protests too.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. First of all, thank you everyone who attended for bearing with us during the tech issues at the beginning. This is actually the first time I've hosted a Zoom webinar, and it's not really something you can rehearse because when you try and practice at home, there's only 2 of you, so you can see who's in the room. So I really appreciate your patience and understanding while we dealt with the tech issues. And I'm so sorry we couldn't come to everyone's questions. I mean, at the peak of this webinar, I think we had more than 250 participants, which is just fantastic and really shows the strength of feeling about this issue, but also means it's very difficult to come to everyone's comments and questions. But we really value your participation. I want to say a huge thank you to Lyle, to Paul, to Peter and Sacha for sharing their insights, their expertise, and for joining us today to talk about this, to James and Carla at openDemocracy for managing the tech, and to the Legal Education Fund for their support on our work on anti-protest rights. We will be in touch to tell you more about our work, and just join me in a sort of virtual hand clap, I guess, to all of our speakers for taking part today. Thank you so much. Cool. There are still people leaving, but I'm just going to say another thank you and goodbye, and I'm going to close the room now. So thank you so much, and I'll send an email around to say proper thanks.
And nice to meet you all. That was really informative for me. Thank you.
Yeah, really great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye.